Yeah, this is working now. Okay, so this is a joint work with Laura Puccio, who is actually a lawyer. So we keep saying, we couldn't have written this paper without Laura's help, because basically she helped us to understand all legal details about rules of origin that are actually crucial in order to think economically about the effect of rules of origin. So Roberto Venturini, who is currently a PhD at the Cares, and Paola Conconi, so you can imagine how hard it was to get the paper into the program. So the motivation for this paper is as follows. I don't have to convince you at this point that there has been two important trends in international trade in recent years. So the first one is the huge increase in global sourcing. So it's more and more common that firms source their intermediate goods from abroad. And as a result, most of trade nowadays is intermediate goods trade. Also, there has been an impressive proliferation of free trade agreements, which implies that nowadays most of trade takes place within free trade areas. So then a natural reaction to these two trends is to think about how free trade areas can affect fragmentation of production. So the most natural way to think about this issue is by saying, okay, firms are going to have more incentives to source their intermediate goods from countries within the FTA because they are going to have lower tariffs. This is the most natural way to think about it. There is like a less transparent way to think about it, which is rules of origin. So rules of origin are rules that define the origin status of a given good. And this is very important because if a good is considered as being produced within the FTA, then this good is going to enjoy low tariffs when being exported within the free trade agreements. Otherwise, the good will have to face higher tariffs. So just to give you an example on how rules of origin work in practice in the particular case of Nafta. So as I was saying, rules of origin are going to distinguish goods which are originated within the FTA and without out of the FTA. So take the example of watches, for instance, which is defined by this code. So rules of origin are going to tell you, in order for watches to be qualified as being produced, as having been produced within Nafta, there is a list of intermediate goods that have to be sourced internally within the FTA. In this case, you're going to have watch movements, watch straps, watch cases. So if there is, for instance, a Mexican producer who wants to produce watches, then this Mexican producer has to source all these intermediate goods within Nafta in order for this producer to enjoy preferential treatment when exporting watches, for instance, to the US. So this is the type of rules of origin we're going to be thinking of. And we think that this, in practice, is a very important issue when thinking about how free trade agreements matter for sourcing, which is actually confirmed by a recent survey by the International Trade Center, in which basically firms report rules of origin as being one of the most problematic non-tariff measures when thinking about why exporting is complicated within a free trade agreement area. So how do we think conceptually about rules of origin? So on the one hand, if a firm complies, then this firm is going to enjoy preferential treatment when exporting, for instance, to the US. Think about the Mexican case. But this is going to be at the cost of sourcing intermediate goods from sources that are not the cheapest ones. So you can think that this firm has the potential of sourcing engines to produce cars from Germany, but if the firm wants to comply with rules of origin, it's going to be forced to source these engines from within Nafta, which might be more expensive than the German engines, for instance. The firm has also the possibility of not complying, in which case it's going to be able to source intermediate goods from the cheapest source, let's say Germany, but this is going to be at the cost of facing higher tariffs when exporting cars to the US, for instance. So then this implicitly, even if the tariffs that Mexican firms are facing when importing intermediate goods from Germany are low, implicitly there is a high level of protection, which is coming through the fact that if I import these intermediate goods from Germany, then I'm going to face later on high tariffs when exporting my final good. And this is why we call it cascade protectionism. So there is an implicit level of protectionism in intermediate goods coming from the existence of rules of origin on final goods. And this is the point we want to make here, which has been already emphasized in the literature, especially theoretically. So in this particular paper, we're going to try to construct a new data set on Nafta rules of origin, which is going to be very particular in the sense that we're going to be able to say for each final good, we're going to be able to construct a list of all the intermediate goods that are restricted by rules of origin. And this is somehow very unique. So why do we focus on Nafta? So first, it's a huge FTA, so I don't have to convince you about that. But what is more important is that the specific feature of Nafta rules of origin. And the specific feature of Nafta rules of origin is that most of the rules of origin in Nafta are going to come in the way of change in tariff classification, which means that we're going to be able to say for every single output which are the goods whose sourcing is restricted. So we're going to go to this Annex 401, which is in Nafta, and we're going to be able to digitize all these rules. And we're going to be able to construct measures that are going to tell us how much restricted is an intermediate input relative to other intermediate inputs. And this is something that Laura helped us a lot in constructing. So what do we find? So we're going to find that there is a differential change in the evolution of imports depending on whether intermediate inputs were more or less exposed to rules of origin. In particular, we're going to find that rules of origin decrease imports of intermediate goods from third countries. Let's say by how much rules of origin decreased Mexican imports from Germany of intermediate inputs of around 30 percentage points on average. So how big this number is? So this basically represents around 20% of the change in imports of these goods during that period. Of course, we're going to find that the magnitude of these effects are going to depend on many things. So first of all, the mechanism, as I was emphasizing before, is going to depend crucially on how big is the preference margin. Remember, what are the incentives for a final producer to comply with the rules? The incentives are that I'm going to be able to export at a lower tariff to the US. Of course, this trade-off is going to depend quite a lot on the size of the preference margin. If there is no preference margin, then I'm not gaining anything by complying with the rule. So the bigger the preference margin, so the more I'm going to gain by complying with the rule. So we show that effectively the effect of rules of origin is actually bigger for goods which have a higher preference margin. So as well, the same intuition applies. If from the point of view of a Mexican producer, the U.S. market is very important in terms of how much I'm going to export to the U.S., then the effect is going to be bigger. So we also find this. And also we're going to, I think, be very careful in defining when rules of origin are going to be more strict or less strict, and this is going to depend on whether or not, on top of the change of classification or changing classification of tariffs, rules of origin, whether or not there's going to be on top of these rules, there's going to be some value-added requirements. So basically, most of the rules in Nafta are going to come, as I mentioned before, in the way of changing tariff classification. For some of them, on top of that, it's going to be some value-added rules. So we're going to define some rules being more or less flexible depending on whether there is these additional value-added rules. So just to go quickly through the literature, so there is some empirical studies trying to think about the effects of FTAs in trade. So they usually abstract from the presence of rules of origin. So we're going to try to contribute to the literature by thinking about rules of origin. There has been many papers thinking about the theoretical effects of rules of origin, starting probably by Grossman in his Your Market paper in 1981. So why there is no a lot of evidence about the empirical effects of rules of origin? Why? Because from a legal point of view, it's very complex to come out with measures that have empirical content, so we can run our regressions. So there has been some papers trying to construct some indexes, trying to measure the strength of these rules of origin. To the best of our knowledge, we are the first ones in constructing a clean measure that basically links input and outputs through rules of origin. So just to give you like a super brief history of Nafta, in 1998, Canada and the US signed the CUFTA agreement. In 1990, Mexico approached the US and started thinking about the possibility of creating a new trade agreement. In 1991, Canada joined negotiations and they started thinking about Nafta. So we're going to use before Nafta, we're going to use 1991 because first it was not implemented. by that time, and actually our data is going to be much better for 1991, so that's why we take as our before Nafta, the year 1991. Then in 1994, there is the arrival of Nafta. Nafta is implemented. So for after Nafta, we're going to take 2004. Why? Because we think that in 2004 there was already enough time for the adjustment to take place, and actually in 2004 there was a change in the rules of origin. So we want to abstract from these further changes in rules of origin. So we're going to look at the Mexican imports in 1991, and we're going to compare these with Mexican imports in 2004, right before the change in these new rules. So how do we construct this data set on rules of origin? So there were like new rules of origin that were not present in the first draft, basically given by the fact that there were new products in the market, so new rules were written down. And we don't have those additional rules that came after 2004, 2003.
We could look at the changes, but one of the main reasons why we also don't want to look at the changes is that we want to look at rules that were sort of exogenous from the point of view of Mexico. And one of the things you should have already said, because you keep thinking about Mexico, is that the reason why we focus on Mexico is that the NAFTA rules were like, the correlation with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement rules of origin is 0.92. So we want to really say, from the point of view of the latecomer, the small partner, these were rules inherited and exogenous. If you start thinking about the changes to the rules, then the endogeneity concern would be.
Yeah. So there are like 4 steps that we carried out in order to construct this data set. So the first one is going to the Annex 401 and look at the rules, then codifying all these rules into a Excel file if you want, and then mapping all the input-output linkages, and finally constructing the variables that we're gonna introduce in our regression. So this is the way rules of origin show up in this Annex 401. So this is basically telling you that for all the outputs falling into this category, let's say for instance men's or boys' trousers, which is given by this code, all the intermediate inputs used for the production of any of these outputs have to fall out of Chapter 62. So this means that if a Mexican producer producing these trousers want to use any of this input from outside Nafta, then it's going to face MFN tariff when exporting to the US, for instance. And then all these additional numbers we have here are additional numbers that define additional rules. So we are going to have like the main rule, which is given by this by the fact that the intermediate goods have to fall outside the chapter, and then some additional rules would say on top of that there's going to be some intermediate inputs which are not in that particular chapter that also have to be sourced within Nafta in order for the good to comply with the rule. And this is the additional requirements I was talking about. So as I was mentioning before, in some cases there's going to be either alternative or complementary value-added rules. So we're going to abstract from the complementary value-added rules, which in principle is going to be on top of the change in tariff classification. We're going to take care of the alternative value-added rules when running our regressions. I'm going to be much more precise about it in a second.
Can I just ask you a question, but just make sure I read this right? So this says, the main rule says that if 1% of input is not from NAFTA in Chapter 62,
correct.
Then it doesn't.
Correct. Even if it's just 1%.
Even if there's nothing in tech about value added there.
No, I just. But it could be. So it's not X. I thought for like autos it was X% of the value.
No.
There are sectors in which there are value-added rules. On top of, so the specific feature of NAFTA is that value-added rules are never used by themselves. They're always used in combination with it. So it's not like you have to have X amount of your inputs. It's like this list, which is this chapter list and the additional requirement.
Okay, so this is the way once we digitized everything that came into the annex. So this is the way it looks like. So we're gonna have the output, which means all the outputs falling into this interval have one main rule, which is all intermediate inputs falling into Chapter 62 have to be sourced internally, plus all the additional requirements. So this means like even if this intermediate inputs don't fall into this category, they still have to be sourced internally. And this come in a way of additional requirements. So what we do is we just convert this data into a data file in which we're going to have for every single output, let's say the thread source example I was mentioning before, we're going to have all the intermediate goods that are restricted to be sourced internally in Nafta. At the same time, we're going to have, or we're going to be able, for every single input, we're going to be able to connect it with all possible outputs. So for every single input, we're going to have the number of outputs for which this input is restricted. And this is actually going to be our main variable in the regression. So basically, this RoOij is going to be a dummy that is going to take value 1 if there is a rule of origin linking the final good I with the intermediate good j. Yeah.
How deep is this? So are there any inputs which are also outputs which have to be sourced?
Yeah. So in principle, if you go to the example of, imagine you go to the example of, yeah, the watch. I'm looking for the watches. Okay, imagine you go to the example of the watches. You can think, wait, there is one thing I can do if I'm a watches producer, which is I'm going to import all the intermediate goods that are necessary to produce watch straps. I'm going to assemble them, and then this watch strap is going to qualify as being having produced internally, then I'm done. But actually, if you look at the rules of origin carefully, they actually make sure this is never the case. So basically, when there is, let's say, good A, which have many restrictions, let's say base 0, B1, B3, B4, B5, all these Bs are going to have as well many restrictions in the inputs they can source. So there is like a network of rules of origin that prevent to escape from the rules by the mechanism you were emphasizing.
Products this might be, because from the moment one product breaks down, then the whole network breaks down, right?
Yeah, I'm going to show you some statistics, but basically the correlation between how many inputs are restricted for a given output, and on average how many inputs for these inputs are restricted is 0.90. So there is a huge correlation in this input-output network in terms of how restricted they are. Yeah, Swati.
Rules of origin of the border, somebody will check, or will they go to the factory?
Yeah, well, this is actually good timing. So this is a form that exporters have to fill every time they want to export, let's say, to the US. So they have to be super careful in explaining what is the origin of all the goods that they are exporting. And as I was mentioning before, if they are using intermediate goods, let's say, engines, then they have to certify that these engines are also qualified as being produced internally. So actual enforcement, in fact, there are a couple of examples in which some firms thought they had done all the paperwork correctly, and then they came to customs, and there was like a simple detail that they had forgotten about, and then didn't qualify for the preferential tariff. So it seems to be the case that enforcement is quite strong.
Yeah, so there are rulings, court rulings of firms that applied and failed. So there's a database that the U.S. Custom keeps track of all these firms. Yeah. We are not using those. In any case, what's interesting is that the burden of proof is on the firm. So it's not that the default is you get preferential tariff treatment. The default is you get MFN, unless you prove that you qualify for origin, in which case you get the preferential tariff treatment.
So from the Mexican firm's perspective, it's domestic, and they have a bill for it that they submit, but it's not clear that the U.S. government thinks it's imported or not.
Okay, so anyway, so this is going to be the main variable we're going to be thinking of, or this is going to be the main variable we're going to use in our regressions, which is for a given intermediate good I. So sorry, for a given intermediate good J, we're gonna have how many outputs, how many final goods I are gonna be. So how many intermediate goods are gonna be restricted for the particular production of the good I? So then X is gonna simply tell you whether rules are actually associated to final goods that have zero preference margin, which in principle we think that they are not going to matter. This is what I was mentioning at the beginning. And X is going to be equal to 3 if there is alternative value-added rules. So in principle, we expect that rules or the effect of these rules, when also including final goods for which the preferential margin is 0, is going to be very weak, then we're going to expect that the effect is going to be stronger. And the effect is going to be even stronger when there is no way to escape from the rules using additional value-added rules. And this is what the type of things we're going to test. So this is just to give you some statistics about how these variables look like. So this is the first panel, includes all the rules. So we are going to have around 700,000 rules. This is broken down by industry. So we're going to have, for products falling into this category, we're going to have that there's going to be a mean of around 57 rules. Of course, once we start eliminating those final goods, which have zero preference margin, we start coming up with a lower number of rules. Once we also take into account the fact that some of these rules can have additional value-added requirements, we actually have even a lower number of rules. So the way we want to think about this first panel is somehow like a placebo. So we expect these rules that apply to final goods with zero preference margin to have no effect on imports, precisely because firms don't have any incentive to comply. And then as long as we move towards these two other measures, we expect the effect of rules of origins to be present. So this is just the way the rules of origin matrix look like. So here we're going to have the inputs, and here we're going to have the outputs. So for a given output, you're going to have all the intermediate inputs that are restricted. This is for the case of RoO1. We're going to have RoO2, and this is going to be RoO3. So in principle, you think, well, this doesn't look as disaggregated as you might expect. But basically, in every single blue dot, you're going to have thousands of rules. So this is just to give you an intuition on how many rules we're going to have. So we have a very disaggregated data set that connects input with outputs. And this is the type of things we're going to have in our regressions. So there is like a further issue, which is that maybe rules of origin applied to output and inputs that are not vertically linked in the input-output table. So there is no way or there is no reason to think why there should be an effect. So we try to take care of that by using the input-output tables. There is a couple of issues about how we match the HS data with the input-output tables, given that the classification is different. But basically what we end up is by having some statistics that are telling us how likely is that an input and an output are vertically linked, depending on at what level the rule is written. So we're going to have some rules that are written at the chapter level. We're going to have some rules that are written at the chapter level. So what we find is that rules that are written at the 6-digit level, those rules are more likely to be written for input-outputs that are vertically linked. So in the benchmark, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on these 6-digit rules, for which we know that it's very likely that the input and the output are vertically connected, and then we're going to run some robustness, taking into account all the rules. But basically, the idea is that for the benchmark, we're going to be looking at rules that apply to input and outputs that are vertically linked in the input-output tables. Yeah.
You're leaving all the diagonals in because that's where almost all the IO stuff is.
Yeah, we're leaving all the diagonal.
So if you do it without the diagonals, is that kind of?
Yeah. So basically, so what you mean is that when you look at this, what you find is basically everything.
Various levels of aggregation. In
Yeah.
The IO tables. The IO tables are coarse.
Yeah.
So most of that's going to, the 6-digit stuff's going to be increasingly within.
Yeah.
So
We have BAA tables, right? So they're not as coarse as that. Right? Still 550 whatever sector.
No,
yeah.
but you're right. Like basically, the rules we're going to be working with are basically the ones in the diagonal. Yeah.
So as
absolutely.
a robustness, if you drop the diagonals and just looked at the off diagonals and still got the same effects, then because the problem with the diagonals is that.
You mean like take those that are not right on the diagonal, but for which we know that they are still connected, and then trying to okay, we can do that. We
I'm
haven't
just
done
worried
it.
that the diagonals have got all sorts. I mean, there's all sorts of convolution of inputs.
Okay, we haven't done that, I think, but we can definitely check. I mean, something we have done, but I don't think it solves your concern, is that in some of the specification we're going to be waiting by the input-output coefficient matrix.
Yeah, I
in
think
the
it would be better
regressions.
just
to drop them.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna be looking at the effect of rules of origin on final goods on the differential evolution of Mexican imports before and after Nafta. So as Paola was saying before, of course, endogeneity is an issue. We're gonna be running the standard diff methodology, which in principle is gonna control for any time invariant fixed effect at the product level, but still there could be some time variant unobservable characteristic at the product level that could make our estimates biased. So in order to deal with that, we first focused on the case of Mexico, for which the rules were mostly inherited from the CAFTA. On top of that, what we do at the end is actually we use these CAFTA rules of origin to instrument Nafta rules of origin, and we still find the same results. So I think this is, in terms of identification, I think we are doing something that is pretty cool, which is there are some rules of origin that comes from a previous agreement. Of course, those previous rules are completely exogenous to Mexico, and then we're using these previous rules to instrument Nafta rules of origin, which are the ones that are going to be playing a role for Mexico. So in principle, we shouldn't care much about endogeneity given the steps that we have been carried out. Okay, so as I was mentioning before, this is going to be standard diff in diff. On the left-hand side, we're going to have the log change in imports of intermediate good J from country O. Here we're going to have the relative change in preferential treatment. So this is going to be the change in the MFN to third countries minus the change in the applied tariff to NAFTA countries. So this wants to control for how protected this good was, or the change in protection for this good J. And then we're going to introduce our variable, which is going to measure for a particular intermediate good J how many final goods are linked to this intermediate good through rules of origin. So we expect this coefficient to be negative, and we also expect the rules of origin coefficient to be negative. So on top of that, we're going to control for trends at the industry level, at the 3G level, and we're also going to introduce fixed effects that are going to control for unobservables at the origin level.
We do that too. We have that.
Yeah, so you mean imports?
Doing log.
Yeah, so we have specifications in which we actually allow for goods that had 0 imports in 1991, and we take the log of 1 plus imports in that case. In this particular specification I'm going to show you now, we are just focusing on goods that were imported before and after, but we have tried also like the extensive margin for imports. Yeah. Yeah.
Why is the RoO is the number?
Yeah. So we have
it's not weighted by the inside-outside final good tariff. I thought that was the key. Was that it was if you fail, you revert to MFN, but if MFN's really close to 0, it's not a big problem.
No. So this is like the basic regression. I'm going to show you some tables in which we're going to interact this with the preference margin of the final good.
Okay.
For which we expect to be, for which we expect that be a stronger effect for those goods for which the preference margin is very high. This is the basic one without interaction terms. Okay, so these are the results for again the basic regression. So here we have RoO1, which again includes final goods for which the preference margin is equal to 0, so we don't find much, which is already suggesting that the mechanism we have in mind is at work. So then we drop all these final goods for which the preference margin is equal to 0, for which we expect the rules of origin not to matter, and then we find some negative and significant effect. And we also find a negative and significant effect once we abstract from those rules with, on top of the change in tariff classification, have also value-added requirements. So the 30 percentage points I show you at the beginning comes from multiplying the size of the coefficient, of this coefficient of 0.20 by the average value of this variable. And then you can just put like these 30 percentage points in the context of the change, of the average change in imports of these affected goods. Okay, so this is already what I said. The effect seems to be larger once we only include rules that are going to be relevant, which are rules that apply to final goods for which the preference margin is different from zero. So here, coming back to the previous question, here we're going to have some interaction terms in which we're going to control for the fact that the effect of rules of origin can be stronger for goods with a high preference margin, and also can be stronger for goods that are heavily exported from Mexico to the US or to Canada. So we expect our coefficient to be bigger in absolute value for those goods for which the preference margin is very high. And also we expect the coefficient to be stronger for those goods that are heavily or that are intensively exported to other NAFTA partners. So those are the coefficients you want to look at. So we actually find that the bigger the preference margin, the bigger the coefficient is in absolute value, and we'll find basically the same pattern for the level of exports. So then we ran some robustness exercises. So the first one, as I was mentioning before, there were some issues when thinking about whether or not the input and the output that were defined through the rules of origin were vertically connected. So we decided to focus on 6-digit rules for which we were more convinced about the fact that they were vertically linked. So if we use the full sample, we're still going to find similar results. So we're going to find similar pattern. This is going to be also the case when looking at rules that only apply, like using the input-output table, using all possible combinations that the input-output table is going to give us, and excluding goods for which the coefficient is zero in the input-output table, and also weighting, instead of dropping them, just weighting them by the importance of the coefficient of the input-output. So this is what Paul was asking before. So we also have a specification in which we look at the extensive margin of imports. So we were considering only countries for which Mexico, or with which Mexico didn't have an FTA. We also have a specification in which we actually include these additional countries. And finally, as I was mentioning before, we use the CAFTA rules of origin to instrument NAFTA rules of origin, and we still find that our effect is present. So it doesn't seem to be the case that the effect we are finding comes from an homogeneity problem of rules of origin for the case of Mexico. So how much time do we have? I'm going super quick.
33 minutes and 25 seconds.
Okay.
So you're okay, actually. You can breathe because, you have overall the paper has 50 minutes and you have 33.36 seconds now. So breathe.
Okay.
You have 3 slides to go, so you can take...
Okay, so what have we done in this paper? So what we have done in this paper is constructing a unique data set which contains NAFTA rules of origin in a way that had not ever done before, which is basically connecting all the intermediate inputs with the outputs for which there were rules of origin. So our empirical analysis, I think in a very convincing way, suggests that there is a clear differential evolution in imports for intermediate goods that were more subject to rules of origin because of NAFTA, which implies that there was a cascade effect in protection. So even if intermediate goods were not facing high tariffs from third countries, they were implicitly being very protected by the existence of final goods on the goods that were using these intermediate inputs for production. So this is exactly what I was saying before. So here we just mentioned the paragraph 5, article 29 of the GATT, 24 of the GATT states that basically. So what we want to, the point we want to make here is that somehow rules of origin can violate the idea of absence of protection faced by non-members countries in the context of FTA, since somehow rules of origin are protecting intermediate goods that are produced within the FTA. So the next question is, okay, we find a differential evolution in imports of goods that were more or less subject to rules of origin. So the next question is, what are the implications of our findings for aggregate productivity and welfare? So in order to say something sensible about that, we would need to have some structure. And maybe a nice way to think about this is to use like recent theories that have been developed in order to understand the input sourcing and trying to embed our rules of origin into these models to see whether we have clear implications for aggregate productivity and welfare. Another possible extension or a different paper we could write is to see whether rules of origin had an impact on inward Mexican FDI. In the sense that you can think that maybe like the producers, let's say German producers of these intermediate goods, the only option they have now is actually come to Mexico and start producing these intermediate goods in Mexico. So we could look at whether or not there was a differential change or a differential evolution in the arrival of FDI in Mexico coming from countries outside Nafta, depending on whether intermediate goods were or not subject to rules of origin. And I think I'm done.
I'm not biased, 37 minutes, whatever. We have like 13 minutes ahead from our paper. So, but there may be a couple of questions, and then we go for coffee. Yes.
I have two fairly simple questions. Number one, as a trade negotiator, and as your new commerce minister used to negotiate in NAFTA, so he certainly knows the issue very well. Does this really open up possibilities to review the program in terms of either toughening or loosening it during the annual reviews of NAFTA when you go through it and you try to find ways of improving the program? And the second, can you please send your study to Mr. Donald Trump or those against him? Because it does show that there has been some benefits to U.S. producers out of NAFTA. Maybe they are intermediate producers along the way. By the way, I'm Steve Landy from Manchester Trade. But this is a great study, and I'm immediately saying to myself, politically I can use it, hopefully, and more important than that, maybe it gives us some good signals for improving NAFTA over time.
No, I think I have one answer for the two questions, which is like, so given our analysis, we cannot say anything sensible about what are the aggregate or gains or losses from rules of origin. So the only thing we can say is, okay, rules of origin had an impact on imports of intermediate goods. So what are the particular losers or gainers of these rules of origin, and whether or not on the aggregate rules of origin are good or bad for Mexico and the US? We cannot say much at this point.
No, but it's not interesting that he's saying, okay, basically we provide evidence of trade diversion in intermediate. So, the rules of origin on the final goods, say the car, meant NAFTA started importing more intermediate, say the engines, from Germany or Japan or non-NAFTA countries. So in terms of the U.S. producers, Manu, yes. We said, precisely if your objective in drafting these rules in '89 was creating more trade within NAFTA and stimulating trade in intermediates, that definitely wasn't, we have trade diversion from non-NAFTA into NAFTA. Whether it was U.S., Canada, or Mexico, that we are not looking at. So we are not looking at whether the displacement of foreign intermediaries, non-NAFTA intermediaries, led to imports from the U.S. or Canada or Mexican producers. We don't have the data to do so. It would be an interesting question.
Yeah,
so, we wouldn't have the firm level. Yeah, we could actually look at that, yeah.
What it basically said is a fairly obvious fact, that if you're going to reduce a duty and you're interested in minimizing the impact on U.S. employment, maybe the welfare impact too, you do better to do a NAFTA with Mexico than an MFN duty reduction to China. And I think that message, when I was making my half a joke, but a little truth behind it too, is that will you please stop hitting NAFTA because it's not nearly as bad as something if with U.S. employment is better off with NAFTA than without if you're dealing with China. That was my only point. Thank you.
Okay.
This is like saying that, what they show here is that NAFTA is not that good. So we show that NAFTA is bad, so therefore, from the politician's point of view, it's good.
What do you mean by good? Exactly. Yeah. If you think about trade diversion being bad, definitely. So that's why you need to embed it. What's the good? If it's the
So two negatives.
Any more questions? Yeah, Maggie. Yeah, then we would need to look at Canada or the US, we need to look at, but then you would worry a little bit more about the endogeneity because the rules were really drafted so about this, so if you look at the political economy of the rules of origin, so you clearly see that there are stringent rules when the US big firms wanted stringent rules, say auto, and there are very lenient rules in, say, IT, where you had IBM, for example, wanting very lenient rules. So U.S. firms played a very big role in negotiating, the rules of Canada, U.S., and these were inherited pretty much by NAFTA. And I think if you're looking at Canada and U.S., you would worry much more about the endogeneity of the rules. So because what you are saying is that we could look at the effect of the NAFTA expansion, so the addition of Mexico, on, say, Canada and the U.S. And I think looking at Canada and the U.S. would be a bit more problematic. But let's maybe, if I. Okay.
Right, and overlaps too, and these agreements are now overlapped, and the rules of origin overlap. It's not as clean as NAFTA anymore at that time, because there's the U.S.-South agreement, and there's NAFTA, and now we have the TPP, right? So, and
that's why we stopped in 2003-4, because indeed. You have had other agreements since, but one of the good legal features of NAFTA is that, unless a legal lawyer, a trade lawyer has to explain me every time this, is that there's no cumulation. So NAFTA, so you can have, there is an FTA between Mexico and the EU, but even if you qualify for origins in your engine, is like the German engine qualifies as being, Mexico within that FTA, it doesn't mean anything for NAFTA. There's no cumulation between these two agreements. So, in fact, cumulation rules become very important, but NAFTA is very clean that, there's, no matter whether something becomes Mexican within the EU FTA, if you want to export to the US, you need to qualify with the Annex 401 rules. I don't want to abuse, so let's go for coffee. Hopefully there is some. Can you make an announcement at the end?
Okay, it's just the panelists for the session, if they can come to the table, so we shortly discuss the panel with Annabelle.